So have you ever taken what you thought was a perfect shot to either get home, put them on your computer, or just zoom in at on site and just to see that it's a blurry mess? In today's video, what I'm going to do is talk to you about your shutter speed. What shutter speed to use in what circumstances and what to think about when you are actually deciding on what shutter speed to use. Because if you want to freeze motion and you want to kind of keep as much in focus as possible, there are certain, let's say, kind of rules that you can just follow to ensure that you get that crisp image or a nice, artful, blurry photo just as you want it. So today, let's dive into this because it is one of my favorite things about photography, that absolute control over your end image, and your shutter speed is such an important part of this. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Christian Eustace, and today we are talking and decoding your shutter speed. There are a few rules that we can go through, and when you're going out and shooting, you're going to know exactly what you need to be setting it at to get that photo that you want. Whether you're shooting portrait, street, fashion, or wildlife, this is the video for you. So what is your shutter speed? Your shutter speed is purely the amount of time that light is hitting either your sensor or your film. So if your shutter speed is very, very fast, you're going to freeze motion very, very efficiently. If your shutter speed is a lot slower, you're going to introduce blur if you're not using a tripod and there's movement in the scene, or you're moving your camera. So you've got to really think about this when you're actually allocating your shutter speed, and it is something that I tend to do when I'm actually deciding what kind of shot I'm going to be taking. It is normally my first decision. That is followed by aperture and ISO, based on my aperture being my depth of field and my ISO being the computer's compensation for the lack of light. So we are going to freeze some motion today and also look at slowing down that shutter speed and how this artistic effect can be introduced into your photos. There are two types of motion blur: when your subject moves and when you move the camera. These can be either artistic, intentional, or it can be by mistake. If it's by mistake, you need to pay attention to this video. If it's for artistic reasons, we can have a look at this as well, and maybe introduce a movement of light, which also gives a lovely effect. So let's have a look at what your shutter speed is really telling us. So let's give you some kind of indications about what kind of shutter speed to use in what circumstances. So when I'm shooting portraits and I am relatively motionless with my camera, and I'm using a medium length focal length, let's call it 50mm for now. So I tend to have my camera set between 1/100 and 1/125 as a bare minimum to ensure that I'm actually capturing a sharp enough image. If we're starting to introduce more movement, or if my focal length is a little bit longer, I'm going to increase that a little bit just to ensure that my final image isn't blurry at all. If we kind of ramp this up to walking around and this sort of thing, we go up to about 1/125. If we start jogging, let's think about start trying to get that number up to about 1/500. And this can be done for casual sports as well. So not too much movement, but you are actually freezing the frame quite sufficiently, and you are capturing and kind of freezing that moment. If you kind of go into a little bit more excitable sports, kicking a ball and this sort of thing, I would go from 1/800 to about 1/1250. This ensures that those movements are really, really kind of defined, splashing water, this sort of thing, diving off a diving board into some water and this sort of thing. You're going to get quite a nice image, but you have to kind of think, let's kind of go up to more that 1/1250 if you are catching people jumping through the air, especially if it's just before they hit the water, because obviously they've accelerated down into it. And for those faster sports, you're talking and kind of birds and all of these sorts of things where you actually really want to capture that flash second. You're thinking 1/1250 up to 1/2000, 1/2500, and then you're really capturing that second, that split second of a shot. So the caveat here is obviously you're going to have to either up your ISO or up your aperture. These are decisions that you're going to have to make at the time, and a little bit of practice in these a couple of different environments is really going to give you that experience that you need to be able to decide confidently from the start. But these are quite good starting points to get you going. And I really suggest just getting your camera, getting out there and playing around with your shutter speeds, get some friends, move around and just see what the result is with the variable shutter speed. So this is very good practice and something that you can do at any point. So you know what shutter speed you need to be using just when you're out and about. So let's think about your distance to your subject, because if you're happy with 1/500 at a distance, if that person is moving at the same speed but is a lot closer to you, relatively they're going a lot faster. So what you're going to have to do is speed up your shutter speed. If it was 1/500, you might need to go to 1/1250, just because relatively they're going a lot faster, and you need to adjust and make sure you capture that motion as you intend it. So in practice, if you are shooting and you do have that variable and the people are moving around, going away from you, towards you, make sure that you have your shutter speed for when they're the closest to you, because then even if they're very far away, you're actually going to ensure that you always have that freezed motion, and it makes sure that you get the shots that you're looking for. Your camera lens will actually introduce a lot of camera shake if it is longer. I'm going to ignore IBS for a second, that's in-body stabilization, because this is something that is a nice to have, but it's not going to fix a shaky hand. So there is a general rule that you can use, and it is 1/, the number of your focal length. So if you have a 100mm lens on your camera, your minimum shutter speed needs to be 1/100. So this is a kind of good rule to start with if you don't want the camera shake from your hands. Anything else on top of that, you need to be thinking, okay, so if I've got my camera shake and I've got a moving subject, yes, take it up to 1/350 to 1/500 to ensure that you're not actually introducing the blur yourself. And there are a couple of things to think about when you are shooting with this, especially if you're actually shooting on a crop sensor camera and using full frame lenses. You have to think about the crop factor and then work that into what you are shooting. So if you're using a 50mm lens and on a crop sensor camera, that's actually the equivalent of about 75mm, and therefore you're going to have to increase your shutter speed to reduce the amount of blur coming from your hands. One thing that you have to think about when allocating your shutter speed is your exposure triangle. So if you are using a relatively fast shutter speed, you're going to have to compensate with your aperture and your ISO. The ISO is obviously the compensation of light from the camera, so I try and reduce that as much as possible because it gets it wrong a lot of the time. So my depth of field and my aperture is the next step that I take. So I choose the lowest possible shutter speed to increase my aperture as much as possible, and then I will keep my ISO as low as possible to ensure that the amount of noise in my picture does not become a distraction in any way. What you also have to think about is, other than your depth of field, is your dynamic range in a photo. So I will increase my ISO if my dynamic range is too wide and I'm shooting in the sun. Some of those shadows are going to be eaten up and you're going to lose a lot of detail in those areas. So what you can do, you can use an ND filter, or you increase your shutter speed and or aperture to ensure that you're not actually losing any of those details in the darks while shooting in bright light, because this all kind of compresses that image. And this is something that you can open up again in post-production, and it gives you a lot more control, and you don't end up with any of that mud in your images and lack of detail, and obviously a lot of noise if you do actually not expose correctly at the time. So when I'm initially deciding what shutter speed that I'm going to be using, I do think about my exposure triangle quite a lot. I try and use the slowest possible shutter speed for my current environment, and then after I've decided on what shutter speed I'm going to be using, I will then go to my aperture and decide what depth of field, then down to my ISO. The only way I'm going to be thinking about my ISO second and not third is when I'm going to be shooting in bright light and I know that my dynamic range is actually going to, that the shadows and the brights are going to be too far separated, that I need to compress this information in. And at that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my ISO, and because that brings the detail from the darks up. And then what I'm going to do is I'll normally open my aperture just to make sure, close my aperture to let less light in, more depth of field, which kind of gives me that ability to open up everything else in post-production. It gives me the control over the scene. I don't always get the image that I want at the time, but I know that in post-production I've got all the information there. I'm not going to be introducing a lot of noise if I'm hitting up the exposure, because I've got the information there in the details at the start. The one thing that I do is, if I can, I introduce more light into the scene, but this isn't always the case for everybody shooting. If you're doing sports, you can't shove a flash in someone's face. If you're doing fashion, you can do. So you've got to think about this sort of stuff when you're actually deciding what image that you're going to be taking, and see what you can do to bring all of that information in so you don't actually lose any information at any point while you're taking a photo. If you are just getting started, there are a couple of things to help you out with this sort of thing, so you're not trying to think about too much all at the same time. It gives you a little bit of space, breathing room, and especially if you're under pressure, it will kind of give you that mental capacity to take a step back and be like, I've got this under control. So we have shutter priority, and this is actually something I'm shooting on now because today is a very, very cloudy day. I've got a big wall outside and it's reflecting light onto me. But because we lose the light every now and then, that was perfect actually. So as you can see, I've got shutter priority on. So it's trying to keep the exposure the same. You can obviously see that the light has changed a little bit in the fact that there's less light on this side of my face, and my LED on my left is actually now the primary source. So this is something that is very, very useful, especially if you're doing some video and you are shooting outside, going into shadows, into light. This is actually quite a good thing to use, as the camera will try and keep your exposure the same. And you can set that exposure compensation anything from normally -3 to +3 stops, which gives you a very, very good variety. It's just about the exposure mapping and that sort of thing. You've got to make sure that it's either, you know, just on one person or, you know, across the average of the entire screen. There is another mode that your camera can aid in getting that perfect shot. It's not something that I like using myself, unless I'm doing a sport lineup where you kind of get the flow from everything from say a guy running up to kick a football to or, you know, someone going off a ski jump and you've got a tripod, and then, you know, you can kind of set the frame up and then have a nice person kind of going all across, or person going through and kicking the ball, and then you get that I think this is really, really cool and a great use of the burst mode. But if you're on a fashion shoot or you're taking portraits at a family event, weddings, anything like this, you don't want to be using burst mode. You want to be in control of your camera and not just clicking and hoping. You want to be intentional with that shot. There are times when you don't want everything in complete focus. For example, taking a picture of a moving car. So you slow your shutter speed down, you pan with the car as it goes past, and then you get a really, really emphasized kind of sense of speed. You get the focus is drawn to that sharp image in a massive blur. So there are different things that you can do while slowing down your shutter speed. And if you're doing something, if you want to do something like this, I would suggest a shutter speed of like 1/15 and a car not moving too fast. If you're going for motorsport and you want to do this or something 1/30, 1/60, you're going to still get a really, really nice kind of that kind of typical shot that you're thinking of when you take something in motion. I've tried doing it with people and this sort of thing, and a couple of dogs. This can always be very, very entertaining. I'll show you a couple of those images now as well. But when you're doing it with cars, bikes, this sort of thing, it can be really fun and you get a really, really good result. This is something that I think you should try. You can also move the light around. Obviously this is not motion blur, but it creates a very, very interesting effect, especially in a very, very dark and moody scene. You can have a spot of light, and I've seen people do light paintings and other artistic things, and well, at this point only your imagination is your limit. You can do absolutely mesmerizing things with this. So freezing motion is a very, very powerful tool. It can be a stylistic choice if you go in the other direction, and it can be a way of you communicating the scene, a way of showing motion in a photo. So this initial decision is so important in aspect to your kind of final result, and this is a good method of storytelling if you want to experiment. But what I can say is, don't experiment on the day. If you're on a shoot, do everything beforehand, then you know exactly what you're doing going into that shoot, and you can just really, really impress everyone with what you know. So these are my favorite kind of hacks to either freeze motion or kind of to introduce the motion as a storytelling kind of tool. If you really enjoyed this video and you have some of the pictures that you've taken with a slow shutter speed, or have managed to kind of capture that really, really cool image of a car kind of moving past, please leave a comment. I'd love to see some of your photos. If you've got any questions about any of this, I'm more than happy to answer them. Just leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Thank you very much, guys.